Hello and welcome to the Happy Hour Hustle podcast with our host, Kim Bodie.
I am absolutely thrilled to be chatting with you.
Principal and fearless leader of 834 Integrated Communications. On this podcast, you're going to learn a lot about a lot, like public relations, marketing, digital, and advertising.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Forgive us if you hear some dogs in the background. We love them, and there's a medium-sized pack at the office at all times.
Fantastic.
So grab a glass of wine, preferably one with ice in it, and learn a little something today. Our guest today is Kate Germano. She's an author, veteran, former Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel, and keynote speaker whom we recently had the pleasure of working with for the Inforum Michigan Capstone Dinner event. She consistently shares her life experiences and stories of combating gender inequities throughout the years within her different roles that she's served in. In her book, Fight Like a Girl, The Truth Behind How Female Marines Are Trained, this story is outlined, and we're thrilled to have her on the Happy Hour Hustle podcast with us today. Enjoy. Welcome to Happy Hour Hustle, Kate. We are thrilled to have you on the podcast for our Real Influencers segment because you've been such a trailblazer for gender equity in all aspects of your career. And just because you're an all-around badass, we're so excited to have you on our program and just learn more about you. So before we hit the ground running with the tough questions, I wanted to know if you're a dog or a cat person, but I see your cat in the background. And so I think I know the answer.
Yeah. And I'm not a cat person with her because she is the meanest animal on the planet. But I have two other ones who are really good. And I'm more of a cat person, but I love animals in general.
You know, we are animal people in general, but Kim is, a dog lover. And I am definitely, I lean towards cats, but definitely have a soft spot for dogs. So anyway, had to get the softball question out there. So, okay, now that extremely important question is out of the way, I would love for our listeners to hear a little bit more about you and your discovery and change making that has happened throughout your entire career, but specifically when you were in the Marine Corps.
Yeah. So I was in the Marine Corps for 20 years and then had an interesting experience at the very tail end of my career, which sort of put me on the trajectory of being in the professional development and the leadership coaching realm that I'm in right now. So flashback to 2015, I had a very successful career. I was an officer in the Marine Corps. We like to think it's the hardest branch, the toughest branch. So I was really in the middle of a very successful career, had been placed in charge of big units for different areas in the Marine Corps. And for my last tour on command, I was selected to lead the only all-female unit in the entire Department of Defense. And that was because at that time, up until last year, the Marine Corps was the only service of all of the branches of the military to continue to segregate men and women in initial entry-level training. So until that point, I had experienced my own challenges with bias in the Marines. What I didn't recognize then, though, is that when you are part of a very small minority, because the Marine Corps also has the fewest women of all of the services, when you're part of a very small minority in an organization, a lot of times you end up adopting behaviors that belong to the majority in order to survive. And so one of those behaviors is frequently overlooking the behaviors that you know are not part of making an organization equitable, and doing that in order to survive, in order to get ahead. And so I was very much party to this. I know it's happening. It's happened to me, but I need to, in order to preserve my sanity and get ahead, I need to be able to overlook those things. And then when I got to Parris Island, when I was leading the 4th Recruit Training Battalion, the differences and the bias were so in my face and how my Marines and recruits were treated and trained that I felt like I could no longer ignore it. And so being the hard charging person that I was, I led an effort. I partnered with my Marines to improve the caliber of training that we were providing to the female recruits to improve their performance. Because what we found was that those females, for as long as the Marines had been training women at Parris Island, the women had never once been able to rise to the level of performance as their male counterparts. And so I very much felt like the way to change the dynamic and the sexism in the Marine Corps would be to help to eliminate the gender bias in the initial entry-level trainings to build trust and to build respect for women. So we were very successful in doing that. However, while most of my Marines very much supported the changes because they recognized their own challenges with bias and sexism, I had a small cadre of Marines who'd been there for a while and didn't believe in the changes. And they essentially went around me to my boss to complain that I was mean and I was being too hard on them. So long story short is I ended up being fired from this very prominent position as a leader of this unit. And that set me on the course where today I try to help people not repeat my mistakes by really trying to educate them on how to communicate differently, how to engage their emotional intelligence, how to understand the trigger that causes our brains to go into fight or flight mode so that they can change the relationship dynamics in their own lives. And so that's how I ended up getting here. That's where I came from.
No, it's so incredible because I had the pleasure of hearing you speak and help promote that event with Inform Michigan earlier. Well, I guess a couple of months ago, last year now. And it was so interesting because no matter the industry that you're in, like we all feel these different things. And especially as women in these different kinds of roles, like you were talking about the fight or flight, and it almost sounded like masking kind of things to me. So like putting up this front of like, everything is okay, everything's fine, when actually, like I always quote back to the Italian Job, they say fine stands for freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. And I think about it every single day because if somebody tells me they're fine, I know they're not actually fine. So you doing that extra digging and like seeing the why of it all is just so impressive to me and so like inspiring. And when I heard you speak, I was like, this is just, it transcends whatever industry you're in. It everyone has felt in some way, shape, or form like this at some point in their life, I'm sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, it's part of being human. It's part of the human dynamic.
Yeah, no. And I really appreciate like hearing it from your perspective because I can see that as a very extreme situation, right? Like when you're in a actual fight or flight kind of scenario, you're in the Marine Corps, right? Like you're protecting people. And at the same time, there's still that divisiveness and you were actively working against that. And it's so interesting to me. So, you know, like now that you're out of the Marine Corps and you're doing these different engagements and working on this type of advocacy against gendered bias, how do you continue that work outside of your speaking engagements? What does that look like in a day-to-day kind of format for you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, part of the reason why this work is so personal to me is I believe that equity and having a diverse and inclusive society, that's just good leadership. So I know a lot of practitioners who make DEI efforts sort of a separate and distinct line of work. And for me, it was important to be able to incorporate it into all of the work that I do to help people grow their leadership, because I think it's incumbent upon every leader, not just women, not just minorities, in order to change the system, right? We all have to be engaged. We all have to be aware. And so it was really important for me to be able to help people understand that exactly what you said, Julia, that a lot of this is part of the human dynamic. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person necessarily because you're biased. It means that you need to be aware of how those biases can creep up and then be prepared to do something in a smart way of communicating to not cause people to go into fight or flight mode when they become aware. So this work is really personal to me, and I incorporate it into professional development work that I do, all of the speaking engagements that I do, all of the leadership coaching that I do, because it's a way for people to understand sort of the systemic factors and barriers at play, But it's also a way for them to understand that every time there's a conflict, regardless of what the conflict is about, individually, we all bring something to that conflict. And the more we can be aware of that, the more we can be aware of the emotions at play, the better we'll be able to communicate to try to resolve some of these systemic barriers.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. And with that and like working towards breaking those down, do you have any tools that you typically share with people of like, this is how you can work through these types of things? And I don't know, I'm big on having some sort of like mnemonic device or something like that. Like I said, with the fine thing to remind me of, this is how I can work through this. And this is a tangible thing that I can do to, continue bettering myself and the people around me.
Yeah, it's a great question. What I would offer first is that in order to change the system, we have to know ourselves first. So I need to be aware of what my own triggers are. And I also need to be thinking about other people's triggers so that when I engage with them, because of my triggers and because of the bias that I experience, I'm doing it in a way that isn't causing them to go into fight or flight mode. And I'm managing myself in a way that will allow me to communicate so that it's not strictly coming from a place of explosive anger, which is really understandable. And it's very common in social justice movement type scenarios, but it doesn't make for an effective engagement where you're changing minds. So I would say first, start with self and be self-aware. And then second, and I know you were at the Inforum event, one of the main things that I try to help people understand is that the brain triggers, easy to remember, put your scarf on, right? So scarf, the brain triggers are status, relatedness, autonomy, fairness, and certainty. And I didn't put them in the right order. I spelled scarf wrong, but you get the point. If you're wearing your scarf, it means you're aware of how you're communicating with others and how you're managing self so that you can have those smart conversations and really try to change the system.
It's so interesting to hear it put in that term, because without all of them, you can't have the end result. So like without certainty or, like all of it together, it is not effective communication. So I completely appreciate that. And it definitely will help others in the future. So I guess, how can this translate to, I guess, not only women across other industries and skill sets, but to other minorities, or just, to create a more healthy working environment in general?
Gosh, that's such a big billion-dollar question. And if it were easy, we would already be there. And I think the reason that it's been historically really hard for minority groups to try to change the system is because that is a lot of weight to put on people who lack the status and the power to make those changes happen. And so in my pea brain, what that means for me is that we have to be able to engage the majority stakeholders to promote change in a way that doesn't make other people feel threatened. Now, you're always going to have the few individuals who are stuck and refuse to change. But I honestly believe that there are many, many more stakeholders of the majority groups who are willing to be a part of change and want to be a part of change. They just don't know how. And so for me, engaging those individuals as allies and ensuring that they understand the human perspective, it makes change much more personal. And when people feel like they're involved in change because someone they know is being affected on a personal level, they're more likely to feel like they have a stake in the fight.
That level of empathy there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. I would say, I know it's a harder nut to crack, but I mean, for those who you need to shift their mindset, what would be some ways to crack that nut, I guess? This is a horrible analogy. Why did I say that?
But I said it first. But I would offer, Julia, that this goes back to something that I say quite frequently to all of my clients. And that is that, one, anything extreme is bad, right? So if you're operating from a place of extreme emotion, whatever that emotion might be, again, self-awareness and self-management mean that you have to be aware that that's what you're feeling, and you have to be able to manage it differently. And then the other thing that I would offer is that when it comes to having those hard conversations, if anger is the only thing you have, that's great because it'll light a spark. But what'll end up happening is you'll burn your own house down. And I found that out very, very personally in the way that I was fired. I was dead angry that my female recruits and my Marines were being discounted and trained to a level where there was this assumption that somehow they couldn't rise to the challenge of doing better and being better. I was angry about that. I was angry that every day we were being belittled and basically called names. But the problem with that is that because I was so angry, I didn't realize that I was setting off alarm bells with my senior leadership, who were mainly men from the majority white male group, right? So if I'm communicating from a place of anger and that's all I have, then I am not necessarily recognizing that I'm coming across in a threatening way to the people who have the ability and the power to make the changes that need to happen. And so it's all about not burning your house down.
That's so tough too, though, because you were just doing, well, from what I can hear, you were just doing your best to not be complicit and just let the same thing happen over and over again. But that fire within you was ultimately what was the reason that they were intimidated.
Well, let's go back to empathy. So yes, and I was right. Yes, I was justified. Absolutely. And I also had the bigger institution in my heart and in my mind when I was trying to make those changes. The challenge is that when the people who have power and who have the ability to make changes, when they feel like you are accusing them of maintaining a system that isn't equitable and that discriminates, fight or flight takes over, right? And so that is inherently the challenge. This is not Kate Germano saying we need to appease at all. This is Kate Germano saying we need to be smart and we need to engage all of the emotions at our disposal, all of the tools at our disposal. Because if anger is the only thing we have, all we're going to do is cause people to move away from us and be resistant to the change.
Absolutely. It goes back to what you were saying about effectively communicating. And in that moment, when I asked that question just now, I was just thinking like these precious male egos, like why should we have to do that? You could be angry. You should be allowed to be angry. But that's just me being, empathetic to you and your feelings in that moment.
No, I get it. And it's, you are right to feel angry, that you should have to be empathetic to anybody in the majority group. But the danger in not choosing to be empathetic is that what we end up doing is we end up lumping all people in the majority group into the category of being complicit without even giving them a chance.
That is an eye-opening way of putting it, honestly, because in that moment just now, like when I asked that question, I was like, that sucks. Like you shouldn't have had to go through that. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. But I mean, it's led you to where you are now. And that kind of journey has, I'm sure, been super fulfilling. But, it's just that moment where you're like, these men, but I guess, is there any other advice you would give to, young professionals who may be feeling some of that, where they want to make a lasting change, but they don't quite know how to have those delicate conversations and step one, I guess?
I think step one is really the relationship piece. And I think that the biggest challenge people have, and I know I have had this, particularly as an introvert, I believed that if I did a good job and I made my unit and I helped my folks be better than they were when I got there, I thought that was enough. And I never understood why social and organizational intelligence were so important. And the challenge is that as we start out, we're just trying to be technical experts, right? We're driving towards being the best we can be in our specific field. But that only gets you so far. And so you get to a point where being a technical expert is no longer enough. And then it's about the relationships. And if you've gone your whole career poo-pooing the importance of understanding organizational politics and understanding why having contacts is important, then you're going to miss the opportunity to create that personal connection that is so vital to making these types of changes happen. So I would say for any young professional, it's about relationships. Everything is about relationships, because one day you're going to get to a point where your technical experience is no longer going to serve you well. It's not going to be enough. It's all about the relationships. And I didn't realize that until it was way too late.
That's fantastic advice, because specifically for me in public relations, everything is about relationships, right? So like at the end of the day, is it a relationship between me and my client? Is it a relationship between me and a reporter? How am I going to leverage these different relationships so that it's mutually beneficial for everyone? Like, I'm not trying to be inauthentic to any of these people, because they're stakeholders in me now, right? So it's interesting to see that dynamic and how you build out those relationships.
Well, not to cut you off, but you bring a really important point about it being mutually beneficial. And one of the ways that you can help engage allies in the fight against any sort of bias or discrimination is to paint the picture that the change you're trying to make is beneficial to everyone. So I love what you just said. And I love that you understand that making it mutually beneficial to both parties is really part and parcel of building that relationship, because it's absolutely true.
Well, right. Because without that, it's just looks selfish, and it looks like you're asking for me. And at the end of the day, like, no one wants to be around somebody who's only coming to you when you need something.
I would offer that when it comes to, for example, sexism in the workplace. One of the topics that routinely comes up is this idea of parental leave. And, there are a lot of people who don't understand why parental leave is so valuable to men and women. And so the more we can take those systemic factors, those systemic issues, and create value for both parties, the more likely we are to have allies who will engage in the fight with us, who have the power, who have the status, who have the resources to make change really happen.
Gosh, I love that. I'm like, Kate, you're fantastic. Oh my goodness. Well, this is just a great conversation, all in all. Outside of the kind of more, the technical kind of things, I wanted to ask you, after you left the Marine Corps and you had your recruits who you were working with, did any of them reach out to you and say, thank you? This is like, do you have any stories around that?
Yes. So this is really crazy. And this is really one of the things that keeps me so positive and forward focused, because it's hard. I have to tell you, it was really hard getting fired the way I did. It was humiliating. It was shameful. It was just all of those negative.
Well, and that was like your family. You were there for 20 years. That's the majority of your life.
It was horrible. And I really felt like I gave it all to this organization only to basically be all. Yeah. So really having that group of women who I stayed in contact with over the years, that has been a really positive thing for my own mental health. And I would offer that I get emails from people completely out of the blue to tell me that they may have been recruits when I was the commanding officer. And at the time, I might have talked to them about the culture of the Marine Corps, and they may have disagreed. And then after a couple of years that go by, their experience starts to mimic and mirror my own. because a lot of those systemic factors are still happening. And so getting those emails from them is so meaningful because it helps me understand, when I don't always feel rational, that I was right and that the changes we were making were right.
Their rose-colored glasses had come off. Like, I mean, it's interesting putting it in terms of like a military type of position, but I mean, it happens everywhere, right? Like, you're there, you're at a place long enough and you finally see like, oh, okay, actually, maybe it wasn't exactly what I had originally thought. And that's okay, because we can work through these things, or, you know, in this case, you know, just continue trying to work through these things.
That's right. That's right. And what I would also offer is that, you know, it is amazing that over the years, the Marine Corps has made the changes that I advocated for so passionately, and so angrily at times. And while they will never reach out and say, you were right, just knowing that women are experiencing a different level of training and challenge and performance is all that matters. It's just, that is so gratifying. And so my hope is that, as much as it might hurt one day, that eventually people are like, Kate Germano, who is that? Because they no longer need to worry about those same issues. That is my hope. And I'm seeing changes happen incrementally. And so again, when those women reach out to me, it's like, wow, that's such a meaningful experience.
Oh, absolutely. I can only imagine, because most of us in life, I would hope all of us in life, want to make some sort of lasting impact. And for you to see that in real time, that's so cool. Like, that's just one of those things that it gives you like the ooey gooeys, is what I call them. You're just like, oh, this is just so lovely for like that kind of gratification to happen. I think that is just fantastic. So I guess kind of to wrap this conversation up, it has been, like I said, such a pleasure talking to you, getting to work with you. Hopefully our listeners have learned something from you in this conversation, and then we'll engage with you further. So with that being said, outside of your book, Fight Like a Girl, how else can people find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I've got a fairly active presence on LinkedIn. I am no longer on any other forms of social media because it just wasn't a good place for me. But I'm also available on online. I do have a website, and so people can reach out and then we can communicate via email from there. So happy to.
Thank you so much, Kate, for being on Happy Hour Hustle, our Real Influencers segment of the podcast, because you are the one doing the real influencing, not the people taking pictures of their coffee on Instagram. And so, like Kim Bodie says, until next time, we'll catch you on the download. If our listeners could hear, I'm wagging, I literally wagged my finger. So there's that.